workmate new player takes TTRPG relationship to crazy stalker X levels, has an in real life power trip, and loses everything. People can get weirdly attached to their characters, but it takes a special kind of person to take it to the point of threats and verbal assault, stalking, and sabotage. I had been DMing a game for some work friends as a way to introduce some of them to the game alongside some long-term players, so that the game would not only flow a little easier, but the requirement for me as a DM to teach the game as a base level would be alleviated somewhat, so I could concentrate on actually DMing. Now, some will say that DMing for workmates is not always a good idea, as it can lead to some in real life issues if things don't go so well. In 20 plus years of TTRPG, as both a DM and as a player, I never really had this issue. Beyond some newfound and failed personal romantic relations that left to some minor issues and some weirdness when a character romance led to confusion off the table. This was one of those times. The game in and of itself was nothing really to write home about. A basic homebrew setup set on the Sword Coast with some basic plagiarism from Neverwinter, with a little Assassin's Creed and Legacy of Kain for flavor. Nothing too spicy, but with enough flavor to keep the veterans interested, while being flexible enough for me, as a DM, to make it easily digestible for the fresh players. It all rather came to a head a little after one of our new players, a pretty generic tiefling warlock, Becca, with a weird flair for the dramatic that I wanted to encourage, got involved in a romantic tryst with one of my established players, a vengeance paladin, George, who was just on the verge of becoming an oathbreaker after finding out that the object of his vengeful crusade had been a fabrication of his own damaged mind, and that he had been the one to do the rather dastardly deed that put him on his path during an extended weekend of drunken debauchery brought about from some spiked ale and a run-in with his emotionally abusive father. It was a weird backstory, a tad grimdark and edgy, but it seemed interesting at the time, so I went with it. This tied in quite well with our little warlock, who had a habit of mixing any and all wild and unusual herbs and random monster bits into concoctions that she would sell in town. For fun, re-rolled on a random effects list, all non-lethal, with a D100 to see what the potions did, and it turned out that this leaned pretty well with her backstory and patronage to a fey trickster spirit. All this time, the story was somewhat focused on the paladin and his present ongoing self-loathing, and the party was debating if George was going to break his oath or seek out those that had spiked his drink back in his hometown. Now, I know that the party were pretty much expecting me to trope this hell and have the warlock be the one that spiked the drink, etc. But I'm not that kind of DM, and I enjoy taking expectations like this and tossing them to the wind. But this one had legs, and I kinda wanted it to be more linked to the warlock's patron, rather than her as an individual. Sessions passed, and we ended up venturing into the Fey realm to confront the definitely not summer lady and her people, which led to the paladin taking a level in warlock himself and focusing his vengeance on those that had actually spiked him, rather than the lady herself, and from a much closer bond with the warlock, who in turn started to focus more toward a hexblade build, while the party druid and cleric respectively took bets on when the pair would hook up, and the other new player, a fighter obsessed with rats, as rodents of unusual size, and the disposal of them via incredible feats of violence were pretty much the cornerstone of his own backstory, sought out new and unusual weapons of rodent destruction. Becca and George bonded quite a bit, so much so that it started to spill over in real life, and the pair kind of started dating. I noted with both of them that although I had no issue with this both in character and out of character, If it caused issues at the table for whatever reason, I would put my foot down as DM and either remove one or both of them from the game. For a while, all was well. There were no real issues until the Warlock's player got promoted in work. As our new team leader in real life, things started off brilliantly. With her able to set timetables so that we, her, the fighter, and myself, would have time off on a Saturday to play and could work Sundays and discuss the previous night's game in our downtime. It really was a dream come true in many respects, at least until the fighter, Sebastian, caused a bit of a ruckus during Becca's and George's role play, where he headed downstairs after a fade to black moment, and I turned my attention to the rest of the table while they role-played Snuggles. Seb, as I pointed out, had a bit of an obsession with rodents, so much so that he had developed an uncanny ability, lucky perception rolls, to always know when a building was infested, and took it upon himself to deal with any scurrying pests for a nominal fee. This had been a fun way to earn some small coin, and the player had really taken to it, even considering ranger levels, so he could lean into it harder. As he was a new player, this enthusiasm had to be encouraged, and thus, with Snuggle Time ongoing, he and the other players opted to head to the basement and play whack-a-mole with the local rodent population for fun and profit. This led to them finding out that the former owner of the inn had at one stage been an adventurer himself, and some low-level magic items had been stashed, one of which was a pretty nifty +1 rapier and +1 buckler, which after some small debate, it was agreed the fighter should definitely keep. The next day, in real life, was a little odd, as the Warlock player seemed a lot sharper than normal and pretty much kept to herself. Nonetheless, the week passed and everything seemed normal until the fighter player found himself scheduled to work on game night. The Warlock player offered her apology and made it seem like this was an oversight and said that she would go out of her way to make sure that this wouldn't happen again. Game night came around, and with no fighter player to take part, he agreed, at work, to simply have his character so exhausted by the prior night's mini-adventure that he would simply pay for another night at the inn and stay in bed while we hunted the town for our paladin's antagonists, or some form of information related to similar incidents. It was at this time that Becca piped up and noted that it would be a shame to leave the sleeping fighter's new shiny toys behind, when George could use them just as well, or better, if we ran into trouble. I nixed this idea pretty hard, and advised that he was attuning to them, and that was clearly why he was so tired. And even if they could take them from the sleeping fighter, I would have to ask the player if this was okay, as it had been agreed by those that found them that the fighter should have them. She seemed okay with this at the time, so I let it pass, in spite of the blatant red flag. Things went fairly smoothly, and once again, the party, after a quick chat with the local guard and some sleuthing, I dropped a plot hook that would lead them out of town to a local distillery. Again, the following day, the Warlock player seemed oddly distracted and didn't want to discuss the prior night's game. So I filled in the fighter on what happened, and he seemed hyped to test his new toys on the distillery as it was bound to have rats. The week passes, and once again, the fighter found himself scheduled to work on game night. As I didn't want to move the game on without him, I canceled the session and opted to simply have the lads over for a drink and some pizza, with a declined offer for a one-shot as they wanted to stay focused on the game in hand. The Warlock player opted to not come, so we had a fairly silly night of Mario Kart and beer. It got to about 11 or 12, and I got chatting properly with my longtime table buddy and present paladin player about the game. He confessed that he had mentioned being a bit miffed on missing out on the rat catching and a chance of a magical item, and had talked to the Warlock player about it during their date night. She had seemed upset that he had missed out because of Snuggle Time, and blamed herself for the roleplay, bed-based distraction. He had shrugged it off as, that's just D&D, and told her that more toys were bound to turn up. It wasn't until an hour or so later that we put two and two together. This led to a bit of a drunk dial and a bit of a blowout between them, when she confessed to intentionally scheduling the fighter away from the table so that the paladin could get the magical weapons, and that she was going to bring him back when I was more fair. The following day in work was less than fun, with the warlock player having a go at me for ruining her relationship, and warning me that if I talked about her behind her back, then I would find myself scheduled on every Saturday from this point on. I countered with, "Well, you will have a hard time playing the game without a DM," which seemed to shut down the threat pretty damn quickly. Saturday came, and lo and behold, everyone was free to play. The scheduling issue seemingly resolved, and we got to rolling dice. Again, for a few weeks, things went well. Magic items did in fact turn up, and a story was in fact forthcoming. What also happened is that in-game snuggle time was pretty much off the table as a paladin, now significantly more wary of the in-real-life power games that his new beau was capable of, opted to keep the party together rather than engage in tabletop randomness. The warlock was less than happy and took to sulking in real life and only paying lip service to the game before eventually opting to retire her character fully and leave the table. One would think that's where this story ends. Sadly not. With no risk of tabletop overspill, the paladin player and former warlock continued to date, and work-based D&D chats continued without the potential fallout, and with a keen interest regarding the retired Becca and George's in-character long-distance love life, which was still more or less now an established character point due to the now combined backstory elements. This was fine until mention of any form of paladin-based flirting or charisma-based interactions were mentioned. He flirted with a barmaid for information in character, nothing more, and I once again found myself working a Saturday and game night being postponed. When that failed to deter the paladin from having an in-character life once again, the fighter found himself on an on schedule and unable to play. It was especially odd because after the first incident, we opted to keep any events regarding the game, and more specifically the paladin, well out of our earshot. Through luck or coincidence, we were able to get round the table together and get a game in with some key story events that there is no way that our former warlock could possibly know about, that invoked the forced swearing of the paladin's firstborn to his fey patron, and a passing off the cuff comment regarding when they were going to do it, as he would have to ask the missus, implying that he was going to procreate with the patron herself to fulfill the bargain. Sunday was hell, our former warlock being furious that I would allow such a thing to happen when I knew the paladin and her were still in a relationship in-game, and that I had to change it immediately or she would again make sure that I was working every Saturday, as it no longer mattered to her as she was no longer playing. I simply said I would move to another day, and that she had no say in what happened at my table. She was less than pleased. I worked the next 3 Saturdays and moved the game to a Sunday or Friday, respectively DMPCing the fighter under his request, when he couldn't make the game night. Again, key events that there is no possible way she could know about kept cropping up in the form of snide remarks and curt comments. I presumed that the paladin had been letting slip or that somebody had said something, but all players at the table swore that they had nothing. It took almost 2 months to find out that she was accessing the paladin's Google Drive and reading his notes. We only found out when he changed his phone and had to reset his Google password. Password I should point out that he had never shared with our former warlock. This led to a full-on fit in work when she demanded to know what happened in-game. When I refused to answer, she called her paladin and demanded he tell her. He refused, pulled her on accessing his Google Drive, and after a bit of screaming match in her office, apparently dumped her there and then, as he couldn't trust her. This doubled down when both the fighter and I requested a team transfer due to internal differences and toxic work environment, which thanks to her little fit, was now office public knowledge. The game suspended for a week or two, while the fighter and myself moved to another team. It got our schedules aligned, and the game carried on from that point as normal. Work did get a little rough, as I was being bad-mouthed quite aggressively, but that ended when the fighter and I started working from home, thanks to the plague times, and the game moved to Discord. Suffice to say, snuggle time is now off my table between players. As for the former Warlock player, boyfriend, lost. D&D, lost. Respect at work, lost. Friends and colleagues, lost. Due to her blow-up at work, she also lost respect and chances of leading additional teams as she blew up in the office. She has 2 strikes now against her from our reports of toxic workplace based on behavior and verbal assault to employees, which seemed to her lose her position as team lead when lockdown happened, and is unlikely to get it back due to those reports. Honestly, that was a crazy ride. At first I was wondering how any of this was bad, but then it got to the Google Drive thing, and I honestly cannot believe the lengths that people go because they are so afraid of their partner doing things, especially in an RPG game. That's so crazy. It reminds me of people, there's probably people that think it's cheating, and she was probably one of them. The fact that she was using her manager leader position against them was also crazy. It does make me feel like if you're in a workplace, it probably isn't best to play RPG with work people, but I feel like it was also going pretty well up until that point. But let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll see you next week. Bye!